The soft hiss of the espresso machine was the only sound Clara allowed herself to make, a gentle counterpoint to the storm brewing in her own chest. At 22, she was a graduate student by day, a student of forgotten histories and whispered memories. By night, she donned the starched black apron of a waitress at the Obsidian, a cathedral of modern cuisine, where the city's gods of finance came to feast. Her life was a precarious balance beam, stretched over a canyon of student loans and the ever-increasing costs of her grandmother's memory care facility. Tonight, the beam wobbled. She had been assigned the corner table, a secluded throne of black leather and polished steel, known simply as the Perch. Its occupant was Alistair Finch, a man whose name was a synonym for power, a titan of industry so reclusive he was practically a myth. His face, familiar from the rare, grainy photos in business journals, was all sharp angles and deep-set eyes the color of a frozen lake. He hadn't looked up from the portfolio of documents spread before him since he'd arrived. Clara approached with a practiced, silent grace, her worn but polished flats sinking into the plush charcoal carpet. She held a single demi-tasse cup of coffee on a small silver tray, the steam rising in a delicate plume. As she leaned in to place it on the table, a movement precise and rehearsed 1,000 times, the cuff of her crisp white shirt slid back an inch, revealing the worn leather band on her wrist. From it dangled a single, heavy silver charm. It was an odd thing, not a heart or a star, but a meticulously crafted mourning dove, its head bent as if weeping, a tiny, almost invisible sapphire clutched in its beak. Alistair Finch's head snapped up. The pen in his hand froze mid-signature, his gaze glacial and dismissive, just a moment before, fixed on her wrist with a violent, shocking intensity. The documents were forgotten. The restaurant, with its hushed reverence, ceased to exist. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged whisper that cut through the expensive silence like a shard of glass. "Where?" he growled, his voice a low tremor of thunder. "Did you get that bracelet?" The Obsidian was a different galaxy from Clara's world. Her days were spent in dusty university archives, her fingers tracing the faded ink of forgotten letters, her ears tuned to the frail voices of the elderly as she collected their oral histories for her thesis. She believed that every object, every person, held a story waiting to be excavated. By night, she translated French menu items and navigated the subtle, brutal hierarchy of a world where a single tip could mean the difference between paying the electric bill on time or sitting in the dark. Her grandmother Maeve was the anchor of her life and its greatest sorrow. Maeve lived now in the hazy, shifting landscape of dementia, her memories a collection of beautiful, broken fragments. The bracelet had been Maeve's, a gift to Clara on her 16th birthday. "It was given to me by a lady with sad eyes," Maeve had said in a moment of startling clarity. "A promise to protect the little dove. You keep it safe, Clara love. Promises matter." Clara had cherished it, the one tangible link to a past her grandmother could no longer fully articulate. Tonight, that link had become a lightning rod. The VVIP booking for Alistair Finch had sent a current of dread through the staff. Her manager, a perpetually panicked man named Gerald, had drilled her relentlessly. "He wants coffee black at precisely 9:15. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact. You are a ghost, Sterling, a coffee-delivering phantom. Got it?" She had nodded, her stomach a cold, tight knot. She'd approached the table with the quiet confidence she had learned to fake, a necessary armor in this world. Alistair Finch was even more formidable in person. The suit was bespoke, the silver at his temples looked like it had been spun from moonlight, and his face was a mask of bored, absolute authority. She had done everything right, the silent approach, the precise placement of the cup. It was the accidental slide of her cuff, a fractional error that had shattered the carefully constructed piece. His question wasn't an inquiry, it was an indictment. Her professional smile dissolved. She straightened up, startled to find his frozen lake eyes locked on the charm. The cold indifference was gone, replaced by a storm of emotion she couldn't decipher. Shock, disbelief, and a deep, ancient pain that seemed to draw all the warmth from the air around them. His voice, when it came again, was louder, sharper, laced with a command that brooked no argument. "The bracelet, on your wrist, answer me, now!" He was pushing himself up from the table, his tall frame uncoiling, suddenly seeming to fill the entire space. Heads were turning. The low murmur of the restaurant was faltering. Clara's hand instinctively went to her wrist, her fingers closing over the cool, familiar silver of the dove. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her training, her composure, everything evaporating under his searing gaze. "Don't be sorry. Be honest," he bit out, a finger, long and accusatory, pointing at her wrist. "That charm, the mourning dove with the sapphire, where did you get it?" "It was a gift," she managed, her own voice a faint echo in the cavernous room. "From my grandmother. I've had it for years." Finch's eyes narrowed, the raw emotion hardening into a dangerous suspicion. "Your grandmother? Who is your grandmother? Did she work for my family? For me?" "No, sir, I don't believe so. Her name is Maeve Collins. She was a nurse," Clara said, a flush of defiant heat crawling up her neck. This was a nightmare. She was a ghost who had suddenly materialized, and now she was the center of a scene being orchestrated by one of the most powerful men in the country. Gerald was already gliding towards them, his face the color of spoiled milk. "A nurse," Finch repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He shook his head, a gesture of violent negation. "Impossible." He studied her face then, a forensic examination, searching for a tell, a flicker of deceit. "Sir, is there a problem?" Gerald asked, arriving at the table, his voice a strained symphony of panic and deference. Alistair Finch ignored him as if he were a piece of furniture. His eyes, burning with an intensity that felt like a physical weight, remained fixed on Clara. He spoke, and his words, though low, carried the force of a tectonic shift, cracking the very foundations of Clara's carefully managed world. "That bracelet," he said, his voice fracturing under the weight of a grief she could not comprehend, "was on my daughter's wrist the day she was stolen from me, 25 years ago." The silence that descended upon the obsidian was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the clink of silverware and the hum of conversation. In that instant, Clara was no longer a waitress. She was an accomplice, a suspect, a keeper of stolen property, standing accused in the court of a billionaire's loss. The small silver dove on her wrist suddenly felt as heavy as a millstone, threatening to drag her down into the abyss. Gerald's office was a cramped, airless box that smelled of burnt coffee and failure. It felt less like an office and more like an interrogation room, a feeling amplified by the two men seated opposite Clara. Alistair Finch had dismissed Gerald with a curt, cutting gesture, his power so immense that the manager had practically fled his own domain. The second man, who had materialized beside Finch with the silent efficiency of a shadow, was introduced as Elias Vance. He was not a physically imposing man, but his stillness was more unnerving than any overt threat. His eyes, a calm, observant gray, seemed to miss nothing. Clara sat on a hard-backed chair, her hands knotted in her lap. The bracelet was still on her wrist, its familiar weight now a source of cold, alien dread. "Let's begin again, Miss Sterling, is it?" Alistair said. The raw, guttural emotion from the dining room was gone, replaced by a voice clipped, precise, and infinitely more dangerous. "You allege that your grandmother, Maeve Collins, gave you this bracelet?" "She did," Clara insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from the truth of the statement. "For my 16th birthday, she said it was important. A promise." "A promise," Alistair repeated, the word dripping with scorn. "And where is this grandmother now?" It was Elias Vance who asked, his tone neutral, almost gentle, which was somehow more disquieting. Clara swallowed, the sound loud in the small room. "She's in a memory care facility. The Willows. She has dementia." The admission felt like laying down her only shield, exposing a vulnerability to men who looked like they feasted on weakness. Alistair Finch's expression did not soften. "How very convenient," he murmured. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his long fingers steepled. "I will be plain, Miss Sterling. The item you are wearing is not a copy. It is a bespoke piece, crafted by the Parisian jeweler Jean-Luc Dubois. I commissioned it for my daughter Lillian for her first birthday. There is a microscopic inscription on the inside of the clasp, a line from a poem, Mon petit oiseau, mon cœur, my little bird, my heart. I would be willing to wager my entire fortune that your bracelet bears those exact words. Clara's blood turned to ice. She had never looked that closely. It was just Graham's bracelet, a part of her own story. My daughter, Alistair continued, the icy control in his tone cracking just enough to reveal the raw wound beneath, was taken from her nursery 25 years ago. There was no ransom note, no witnesses. She and the nurse who was on duty that night vanished without a trace. The bracelet was the only thing missing from the room besides Lillian herself. He paused, letting the crushing weight of his tragedy fill every corner of the office. So you can appreciate my skepticism when a waitress appears 2.5 decades later, wearing my stolen child's bracelet, claiming it was a gift from her grandmother, a nurse who now conveniently remembers nothing. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but suffocating. Thief, liar, grave robber. I am not a liar, Clara said, a spark of anger cutting through the fog of her fear. And my grandmother is not a thief. There has to be another explanation. I agree, Alistair said, his voice smooth as polished granite. And I intend to find it. Mr. Vance will be conducting a comprehensive background investigation into you and Maeve Collins. Every school you attended, every apartment you've rented, every dollar you've ever earned. We will dissect your grandmother's employment history, with a particular focus on the period 25 years ago. We will find the connection. This is insane, Clara breathed, shaking her head. You can't just bulldoze into my life like this. Watch me. Alistair's voice was the sound of a closing vault door. There is an alternative. You can give me the bracelet right now. Tell me the truth, that you bought it at a pawn shop, that you found it. I don't care what the lie is, and I will be generous. A sum of money that will erase your student debt, secure the finest care for your grandmother for the rest of her life, and fund your little historical pursuits indefinitely. You walk away, and we never speak of this again. The offer was a lifeline and a fist to the gut all at once. For one dizzying, traitorous moment, Clara considered it. A life free from the constant, grinding pressure of debt. A life where she could afford more than just the basics for Maeve, where she could focus on her studies without the looming specter of eviction. It was a tempting vision of an easier world, but it would mean branding her grandmother a criminal. It would mean spitting on the one precious, tangible memory Maeve had given her from a time before the fog rolled in. It would mean betraying the woman who had raised her, loved her, and sacrificed everything for her. She looked Alistair Finch directly in his frozen eyes. The bracelet is not for sale, and you can investigate all you want. You won't find what you're looking for, because my grandmother is a good person. A flicker of something, surprise, grudging respect, crossed Alistair's face before the mask of cold authority slammed back down. He stared at her for a long, heavy moment, a predator calculating its next move. Very well, he said, finally rising to his feet. The audience was over. You will consider yourself on administrative leave from this establishment, effective immediately. He paused. With pay, he added, a gesture that was less about fairness and more about absolute control. You are not to leave the city. Mr. Vance will be in contact. He will require access to your grandmother's personal effects, any old photographs, letters, documents. You will cooperate. If you do not, I will unleash a team of lawyers upon you that will dismantle your life, piece by tedious piece, until you have nothing left but questions. Is that understood? Clara rose on legs that felt like jelly, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She was no longer in a manager's office. She was in a gilded trap, and Alistair Finch held the key. Understood, she whispered. As she stepped out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, the glittering lights of the city felt like the eyes of 1,000 hostile witnesses. Hours ago, she was an anonymous student, a face in the crowd. Now she was the central figure in a billionaire's obsessive quest, her entire identity thrown into chaos by a weeping silver dove. The Willows was a place where stories went to fade. The air smelled of lavender, potpourri, and bleach, a cloying combination meant to be soothing, but which only served to underscore the scent of slow erasure. Clara hated it. She hated the gentle, condescending tones of the staff, the relentlessly cheerful floral wallpaper, and most of all, she hated seeing the brilliant, vibrant woman who had raised her slowly untethered from her own life. Maeve was in the sunroom, meticulously folding and refolding a napkin. Her hands, once so capable, the hands of a nurse who could soothe a fevered brow or start an IV in a single, fluid motion, were now restless, always searching for a task to anchor them. "Graham?" Clara said softly, touching her shoulder. Maeve looked up, her faded blue eyes, once as sharp as a winter sky, clouded with confusion. Then a spark, a brief clearing in the fog. "Clara, love, you brought the sunshine with you." Clara's heart clenched. "Always for you, Graham." She pulled up a chair, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "How are you today?" "The linens are wrinkled," Maeve said, her focus returning to the napkin. "He won't like that. Everything has to be just so. The cold house is always so particular." It was one of her loops, a recurring fragment of a memory Clara couldn't place. She had long ago learned that pushing against the loops was like pushing against the tide. Instead, she gently took her grandmother's hand, the skin as thin and delicate as onion skin paper. "Graham, I need to ask you about something. It's important." Clara held up her wrist, the silver dove catching the afternoon light. "My bracelet. You told me it was from a lady with sad eyes. You said it was a promise." Maeve's gaze fixed on the charm. For a long, breathtaking moment, the fog seemed to part. Her brow furrowed, a genuine spark of cognitive effort in her eyes. "The little dove," she murmured, her thumb stroking the smooth silver. "It cried. The baby cried and the little dove cried too." Clara's breath caught. This was new. "What baby, Graham? Whose baby?" "A promise is a promise," Maeve whispered, her hand tightening on Clara's. "The lady was so scared of her. The one with the serpent smile." "Who, Graham? Who had a serpent smile?" Clara pressed, her heart beginning to pound. This felt different. This felt like a real memory, fighting its way to the surface. But the connection frayed. The moment was lost. Maeve pulled her hand back and began smoothing the napkin again, her expression agitated. "The car is waiting. We have to be quick. Before he gets back. Before she sees. We have to keep the little dove safe." The conversation, if it could be called that, was over. Clara stayed for another hour, talking about her classes, reading from a book of poetry Maeve had once loved, hoping for another flash of lightning in the storm of her grandmother's mind. But it never came. She left the Willows with a chilling sense of purpose. The cold house, the crying dove, a promise, the serpent's smile. These weren't just the ramblings of a failing mind. They were clues. They were pieces of a story her grandmother could no longer tell. And Clara, the student of forgotten histories, knew she had to be the one to put them together. Back in her cramped studio apartment, the familiar smell of old books and brewing tea was a small comfort. Alistair Finch might have his army of investigators, but Clara had her own skills. She knew how to listen to the silences, how to find the stories hidden in the margins. Under her bed was a large, battered steamer trunk, a repository of Maeve's life before the Willows. It was a time capsule Clara rarely opened, a painful monument to the woman she was losing. Now she hauled it out, dust motes dancing in the single shaft of late afternoon sun. For hours she sifted through the archaeology of her grandmother's past. Yellowed nursing school diplomas, photographs of a young, smiling Maeve with friends, stacks of well-worn paperback novels. There was nothing to connect her to the world of Alistair Finch, no hint of a life lived among the ultra-wealthy. Her grandmother's life appeared painfully, reassuringly ordinary. A dedicated nurse, a single woman who had taken in her orphan grandchild and raised her as her own. Just as despair began to set in, her fingers brushed against a stiff, fabric-covered panel at the bottom of the trunk. A false bottom. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Prying it open, she found not a treasure, but a small, plain cardboard box tied with faded string. Inside, nestled in yellowing tissue paper, was a collection of items. A single, pristine white baby shoe. A lock of downy blonde hair tied with a blue ribbon. And at the very bottom, a handful of old pay stubs and a single, folded letter. The pay stubs were from 25 years ago. The employer was not a hospital, but a private entity. The Finch Estate, Northwood Manor. The cold house. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. The paper was brittle, the handwriting elegant but strained. My dearest Maeve, it began. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened. You are the only one I trust. He is a good man, my Alistair, but he is blinded by family. He does not see the poison in her heart. Beatrice covets everything I have. My husband, my life, my child. She jokes about it, but her eyes are cold as a winter sea. I see how she looks at Lillian, like she is not a baby, but an obstacle. I have seen her talking to the night security guard. I have seen money change hands. She thinks I am a fool. She is planning something. She speaks of taking Lillian on a trip, just the two of them. I am terrified. Alistair is away on business for another week. I cannot go to the police with only suspicion. They will think I am a hysterical new mother. So I am trusting you. This is my desperate, impossible plan. The money in the envelope is all the cash I could get without raising alarm. There is a car waiting for you, as we discussed. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, you disappear too. You take my Lillian and you run. Raise her as your own. Love her as your own. Keep her safe from the woman with the serpent smile. It is the only thing I ask. It is the promise I need you to keep. Protect my little bird. Protect my heart. Yours in desperation. Seraphina Finch. Clara sank to the floor, the letter clutched in her hand. The baby shoe, the lock of hair, they belonged to Lillian Finch. The weeping dove on her wrist was not a stolen trinket. It was a desperate mother's sigil, a cry for help across a quarter of a century. Her grandmother was not a kidnapper. She was a rescuer, a woman who had honored a sacred promise, sacrificing her name, her career, her entire life to save a child from a monster hiding in plain sight. The phone buzzed on the floor beside her, a harsh modern sound in the sudden, sacred silence of the room. A blocked number. Miss Sterling, the calm, steady voice of Elias Vance said, Mr. Finch has requested your presence. A car is on its way. Alistair Finch's office was a shrine to control. Perched 60 stories above the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows displayed Manhattan as a conquered map. But for days, Alistair had seen none of it. He'd been staring at a single, high-resolution photo on his monitor. Clara Sterling, serving coffee. The weeping dove stark against her skin. Hope was an acid, and he had spent 25 years cauterizing any part of himself that might be vulnerable to it. After Lillian vanished, he had poured a fortune into a private investigation that spanned a decade. He'd chased down charlatans and con artists, followed false leads to the ends of the earth. The search had yielded nothing but a deeper hollowing of his soul and a thicker wall around his heart. And now this waitress, this young woman with her grandmother's fragmented stories and eyes that held a defiant honesty that infuriated and intrigued him in equal measure. Anything? He asked without turning as Elias Vance entered the office, his footfalls silent on the hand-knotted silk rug. We're building a narrative, Elias said, his voice the calm center of Alistair's storm. He placed a slim tablet on the massive obsidian desk. Catherine Clara Sterling, 22, graduate history student at Columbia, specializing in 20th century oral histories. Top of her program, works 40 hours a week at the Obsidian to pay for her grandmother's care and her tuition. No boyfriend, few close friends, no digital footprint to speak of. She's an analog girl in a digital world. Her life is quiet, almost invisible. The grandmother, Alistair prompted, his eyes still fixed on Clara's photo. Maeve Collins, Elias continued. That's where the narrative shifts. She was a pediatric nurse, impeccable record at Mount Sinai for over a decade. Then 25 years ago, she vanished. Quit her job without notice. emptied her small apartment, dropped off the face of the earth. Alistair finally turned, his full, unnerving attention fixed on Elias. When, exactly? The day after Lillian disappeared. A cold, heavy stillness settled over Alistair. Go on. For 2 years, there's a complete void. No credit history, no tax records, no address. Then she reappears in a small town in Vermont, gets a job at a local clinic. Her employment records note she is the sole guardian of her 2-year-old granddaughter, Clara, whose parents, she claimed, were killed in a car accident. A lie, Alistair stated. It wasn't a question. A comprehensive fiction, Elias confirmed. We can find no record of Maeve Collins ever having a child of her own. We're searching for Clara's birth certificate, but I suspect it will lead to a dead end or a forgery. What's more interesting is Maeve's financial state. For those 2 years she was off-grid, she made small, regular cash deposits into a newly opened bank account under an assumed name. Not large sums, but just enough to live on. Where did the money come from? Alistair demanded, a vein pulsing in his temple. That's the question. But I went back to the original police files on Lillian's disappearance. It was treated as a kidnapping, but it never fit the profile. No ransom, no contact. The lead detective at the time had a private theory he was ridiculed for. He believed it was an inside job. He focused on the staff, but he always had a particular interest in one person. Your sister-in-law. Beatrice, Alistair said, the name like a shard of ice in his mouth. His late wife Seraphina's younger sister, Beatrice Davenport, had always been a dissonant note in their lives. While Seraphina was gentle, artistic, and deeply private, Beatrice was sharp, social, and consumed by an ambition that she wore like expensive perfume. She had always treated Seraphina's marriage to Alistair less like a union of love and more like a lottery she had inexplicably lost. After Seraphina's death from a sudden illness 5 years after Lillian's disappearance, Beatrice had seamlessly installed herself as the matriarch of the Finch family's charitable foundation, a constant, perfectly coiffed presence at his side. Beatrice Davenport, Elias said, swiping to a new file on the tablet. She was staying at your Northwood estate at the time of the disappearance. Her official statement was that she was at a neighbor's house for dinner. Her alibi was the night security guard. The same guard who retired and moved to Florida on a surprisingly generous pension a month later. Alistair finished, a dark memory surfacing. Precisely, Elias said. My forensic accountants are digging into her finances from that period. It's a labyrinth of shell corporations. But they found something. A significant cash withdrawal, $50,000 made 2 days before Lillian was taken. The cash was never traced. He paused, letting the implications settle. There is one more thing. Maeve Collins, before she vanished, her last official assignment was a short-term private nursing contract. Alistair felt a jolt, as if the floor had dropped from under him. Don't. The client was your wife, Seraphina, Elias said quietly. She had hired Maeve to help with Lillian for the month you were overseas. The air in the room grew thin, hard to breathe. The waitress's grandmother was not a random thief. She was there. She was in his house, in his daughter's nursery, in the days and hours leading up to the abduction. Alistair Finch stared out at the city, but all he saw were the ghosts of 25 years of unanswered questions. Maeve Collins wasn't a suspect in a kidnapping. She was the primary witness. She was the missing piece. And she had placed herself in the child Alistair now desperately, terrifyingly allowed himself to hope was his daughter, at the very epicenter of his life's defining tragedy. The question was no longer if she was involved. It was how. And for the first time, a new, more terrifying question emerged. On which side? The ride to Finch Tower was a silent, tense journey through a city that no longer felt like home. Clara clutched the faded letter in the small cardboard box in a tote bag on her lap. Her heart was not frantic anymore. It was beating with a slow, steady rhythm of purpose. She was no longer just a waitress or a student. She was her grandmother's historian, her mother's defender. She was escorted directly to Alistair's penthouse office. He was standing by the window, a formidable silhouette against the twilight sky. He turned as she entered, and his face was a battleground of warring emotions, fury, suspicion, and a sliver of desperate, agonizing hope. My investigator has been, Thorough, Alistair said, his voice tight. He has informed me that your grandmother was employed by my wife. Yes, Clara said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a newfound authority in the cavernous office. She was, and she didn't steal your daughter. She saved her. She walked to the vast obsidian desk that separated them and carefully placed the cardboard box upon it. She laid out the contents: the single baby shoe, the lock of blonde hair, and finally Seraphina's letter. This is a letter from your wife to my grandmother, she said, her voice unwavering. Your wife was afraid, not of a stranger, but of her own sister, Beatrice. She believed Beatrice was planning to harm Lillian. She begged my grandmother to make a promise that if anything happened to her, Maeve would take Lillian and run, to protect her. Alistair stared at the items on his desk, his hand hovering over the brittle paper as if he were afraid it would turn to dust if he touched it. He looked from the letter to Clara's face, his gaze sweeping over her features, the shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He was searching for a ghost, a whisper of his wife, a shadow of himself. As he reached for the letter, Elias Vance's phone emitted a low, discreet chime. He answered, listened for a moment, and for the first time, his professional mask cracked. A look of grim finality settled on his face. He ended the call and looked at his employer. Sir, Elias said, his voice laden with significance, my accountants found it. A needle in a 25-year-old haystack, an untraceable wire transfer funneled through 3 countries, originating from a trust controlled by Beatrice Davenport. The recipient was a Dr. Albin, who ran a small, private clinic in rural Pennsylvania. Alistair looked up, his face ashen. Dr. Albin, Elias continued, specialized in creating false birth certificates and adoption papers for wealthy clients looking to circumvent the system. The transfer was made the same week a Jane Doe infant was miraculously found on his clinic's doorstep and subsequently adopted by a grieving widow whose child had supposedly been stillborn. The widow's name on the falsified documents was Maeve Collins. The room fell silent. On the desk lay the story of a mother's desperate love. In the air hung the digital ghost of a sister's monstrous betrayal. 2 narratives, one written in frantic, loving ink, the other in cold, calculated code, had converged in this room to tell the same horrifying truth. Alistair Finch finally picked up the letter. His hands, which could move markets and command empires, trembled as he read his wife's words. He looked from the faded script to the face of the young woman standing before him, her expression not of fear, but of profound, sorrowful conviction. And the wall of ice he had built around his heart for a quarter of a century did not crack. It vaporized. The Finch Legacy Prize ceremony was the glittering apex of the city's philanthropic season. Held in the grand atrium of the Museum of Modern Art, it was a night where old money and new tech mingled under soaring ceilings, sipping champagne and applauding the power of their own generosity. Beatrice Davenport was the evening's empress. In a gown of crimson silk that shimmered under the gallery lights, she moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a monarch, accepting accolades for the foundation's work. As its chairperson, this was her stage, a platform from which to display her compassion, her civic-mindedness, her seamless stewardship of the Finch family name. She found Alistair by the sculpture garden, a brooding statue among the Calders. He looked more remote than ever, a man carved from shadow. She glided to his side, her expression a perfect portrait of solicitous concern. Alistair, darling, she purred, laying a diamond-clad hand on his arm. You're here. I was so worried you'd shudder yourself away again. To see you here, supporting the family's work, it means the world. It's good to see you too, Beatrice, he said. His voice was flat, devoid of warmth. His eyes were like chips of flint. We should talk. Of course, my love, but the photographers from the Times are waiting. Can it not wait until after my speech? No, he said, his gaze sweeping over the opulent scene. It can't. In fact, I think we should talk right here, in front of all these people who so admire your dedication to family. A flicker of confusion, of irritation, crossed Beatrice's perfectly made-up face. This was not in her script. Before she could formulate a reply, Alistair gestured towards the main entrance. Elias Vance walked in. And beside him, looking both overwhelmed and utterly resolute in a simple, elegant navy dress that Alistair had sent to her apartment that afternoon, was Clara. A wave of murmurs rippled through the nearby guests. The sight of the reclusive billionaire with his head of security and a striking, unknown young woman was an anomaly potent enough to halt conversations midair. "Alistair, who is this?" Beatrice demanded, her voice losing its silky texture, gaining a sharp, brittle edge. She looked at Clara with cold dismissal. "The catering staff should be using the service entrance." "This," Alistair said, his voice ringing out, clear and powerful, drawing more and more eyes, "is the young woman whose life you stole 25 years ago." The silence was now a physical presence, a vacuum that sucked the air from the atrium. Beatrice let out a high theatrical laugh. "Alistair, what on earth are you talking about? Have you been drinking? Grief does terrible things to a man. We all know that. But this is a pathetic public spectacle." "Let's talk about pathetic spectacles, Beatrice," Alistair continued, his voice rising, each word a hammer blow against the gallery's marble walls. "Let's talk about a nursery in Northwood. Let's talk about a loyal nurse and a terrified mother. Let's talk about a falsified birth certificate from a corrupt doctor in Pennsylvania, paid for with $50,000 in cash you withdrew 2 days prior." Beatrice's face went slack, the blood draining from it, leaving her skin a waxy, translucent white. These are ludicrous fantasies. You have no proof." "Don't I?" Alistair retorted. He took a step closer, his sheer presence forcing her back. "I have the confession of the night guard you paid off. I have the bank records from your hidden trust. I have the sworn statement of the doctor you paid to create a new identity for an infant girl. And I have a letter from my wife, your sister, written the day before she died, naming you as the threat she feared most." Beatrice began to tremble, her eyes darting wildly, seeking an ally in the sea of shocked, staring faces. The people who had been fawning over her moments before now looked at her as if she were a venomous creature that had slithered into their midst. "It's a lie!" she shrieked, her carefully constructed poise shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Serafina was always so dramatic, so fragile. She was jealous of my strength, of my connection with you. Was she jealous when you slipped the sedatives into her nightly tea?" Alistair's voice was now a low, deadly snarl. "Was she being dramatic when her heart, already weakened from childbirth, finally gave out years later under the strain of what doctors called unexplained chronic fatigue? The same fatigue caused by the slow, steady administration of a poison that is almost untraceable after the fact?" Clara stepped forward then, her voice shaking but clear. "My grandmother saved me," she said, looking directly at Beatrice, her eyes filled not with hate, but with a profound, sorrowful clarity. "She kept her promise to a dying woman. She gave up her entire life to keep me safe. From you." The final piece, the living proof, the stolen child, now a woman, wearing the weeping dove on her wrist like a medal of survival. Beatrice stared at Clara, at the face that was a haunting echo of the sister she had envied and the man she had craved. And then something inside her broke. "She had everything!" Beatrice screamed, the sound raw and ugly, echoing through the cathedral of art. "She was the beautiful one, the beloved one. She got the life that should have been mine. She got you. That baby was just one more thing she had that I deserved. It was supposed to be easy. I was going to raise her as my own, the perfect daughter for the life I was meant to have. But that meddling nurse, she ruined everything. Her confession, a torrent of venom and ancient jealousy, hung in the poisoned air. Security guards were moving in. The press, no longer held at bay by velvet ropes, surged forward, their cameras flashing like a furious lightning storm. Beatrice Davenport's public execution was complete. As she was led away, sobbing and spitting curses, a grotesque parody of the elegant hostess she had been minutes before, Alistair Finch turned to Clara. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time, not as a clue or a ghost, but as his daughter, his Lillian. And there, in the center of the swirling chaos, Surrounded by the wreckage of a 25-year-old lie, he reached out and gently, tentatively, took her hand. The daughter he had hunted for, mourned for, and almost given up on, was finally home. The weeks following the gala were a disorienting blur of screaming headlines, courtroom procedures, and the relentless glare of the public eye. The story of the long-lost Finch heiress was a modern fable, and Clara, or Lillian, as the world now insisted on calling her, was its unwilling princess. She was a ghost made flesh, and everyone wanted a piece of her. The DNA test was a formality conducted in the hushed, sterile environment of a private lab. Alistair didn't need the confirmation. He felt the truth in the marrow of his bones. But the world and the legal system demanded its pound of scientific flesh. He read the report, probability of paternity, 99.99%, and felt not a surge of triumph, but the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had just finished running a marathon that had lasted for half his life. He showed the report to Lillian in the heavy silence of his penthouse library. She glanced at it, her expression unreadable, and handed it back. "Okay," she said quietly. The piece of paper felt insignificant next to the searing truth of her mother's letter and the fragmented, heroic love of the grandmother who raised her. Now the truly impossible work began, building a bridge across a 25-year abyss. They were father and daughter, yet they were strangers, their lives shaped by vastly different universes. Alistair, in his grief-stunted, awkward way, tried to pave the bridge with money. He arranged a family dinner at a restaurant where the food was deconstructed into foams and essences, and the silence between them was the most substantial thing at the table. He talked about acquisitions and third-quarter projections. She stared at her plate and thought about the grilled cheese sandwiches Maeve used to make. He bought her a new wardrobe of designer clothes that felt like a costume, a luxury car she didn't know how to drive, a palatial apartment in his building with a view of a city she had only ever known from the ground up. He was trying to give her the life Beatrice had stolen, but that life wasn't hers. Her life was the smell of old paper in the archives, the weight of a book in her hands, and the heartbreaking unconditional love of a woman who was slowly forgetting her name. The chasm between them seemed to widen with every well-intentioned, extravagant gesture. He felt like a failure, unable to connect with his own child. She felt like an imposter, drowning in a life that didn't fit. The breakthrough came not in a penthouse, but in the quiet, lavender-scented hallway of the Willows. They drove there in his Maybach, the silence between them for once not empty, but thick with a shared, unspoken dread. How could he possibly face the woman who had succeeded where he had failed, who had protected his daughter at the cost of her own life? How could she explain a truth so monumental to a mind that could no longer hold on to the simplest of facts? They found Maeve in the sunroom, looking out at the garden. Lillian knelt by her wheelchair and took her hand. "Graham," she said softly, "I brought someone I want you to meet." Maeve looked up, her gaze drifting past Lillian to the tall, imposing man standing hesitantly in the doorway. A long, silent moment stretched. The fog in Maeve's mind seemed to part, her pale blue eyes focusing with an astonishing, piercing clarity. She looked at Alistair, truly looked at him, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, the silver at his temples, the color of his eyes. "You," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You have her eyes, my lady's sad, kind eyes." The mention of Seraphina, so simple and direct, struck Alistair like a physical blow. He had prepared speeches of gratitude and apology, but they all dissolved. He took a step forward, his own eyes suddenly blurred. "Yes, Maeve?" he managed, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "I'm Alistair, Lillian's father." A slow, serene smile spread across Maeve's face, a look of profound peace. "My little dove," she murmured, her gaze shifting to Lillian. "I kept my promise. I kept you safe." She reached out a trembling hand and touched Lillian's cheek. The promise is kept. It was as if a great heavy burden she had carried in the deepest recesses of her memory had finally been lifted. She gave Alistair one last long look. "She was a good woman, your Seraphina. She loved you both so very much." Then, as quickly as it had come, the lucidity faded. The fog rolled back in, and she began to fret over a loose thread on her cardigan, lost once more in the shifting currents of her own world. The first hour of the drive back was silent. Finally, Alistair spoke, his voice raw. I spent 25 years hating the world for what it took from me. I built an empire as a fortress against my own grief. And I never once imagined, never once allowed myself to hope that someone was spending those same years just loving her, protecting her. She gave up everything for a promise to my wife. He turned to her, his face a mask of awe and shame. What your grandmother did, it's the most courageous thing I've ever known. She's my mom, Lillian replied, her voice firm with the simple, unshakable certainty of a lifetime. She did what mothers do. She loved me. That was all I ever needed. That day, the ground shifted. Alistair stopped trying to buy back a stolen past and started clumsily to learn about the present. A few days later, he appeared unannounced at her old studio apartment, which she hadn't yet been able to abandon. He stood in his $1,000 suit amidst the clutter of books and research notes, looking utterly alien, but he didn't comment on the cramped space. He walked slowly around, looking at the photographs on her wall, the notes for her thesis pinned to a corkboard. He stopped in front of a detailed historical map she had been annotating. What is this? He asked, his voice quiet. It's for my thesis, she explained. I'm mapping the forgotten stories of one neighborhood, tracking how personal histories, the stories people tell themselves, shape the physical and social landscape over time. He nodded, not just listening, but hearing. He wasn't just looking at a map. He was looking at her. He saw the passion, the intellect, the dedication. He saw the historian Maeve had raised, not just the ghost of the baby he had lost. You have a gift, Lillian, he said, the name sounding a little less strange on his tongue. A real one. The next day, he didn't present her with a diamond bracelet. He presented her with a proposal. He wanted to fund her work, not just her thesis, but a new ambitious project under the Finch Foundation, the Maeve Collins Archives, a major initiative dedicated to preserving the oral histories of ordinary people, ensuring their stories were not lost to time. It wasn't a gift for his heiress. It was an endowment for the historian. It was a gesture that honored the woman she was not the child he had lost. One crisp autumn afternoon, he found her sitting on a bench in Central Park reading. He sat beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee from a street cart. They sat for a while in a comfortable silence, watching the city go by. I was never really Clara Sterling, she said softly, not looking up from her book. That was a name to keep me safe, and I don't know if I'll ever feel completely like Lillian Finch. That name belongs to a baby in a photograph. She closed the book and looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. I think I'm just me, somewhere in the middle. Alistair looked at her, at the determined line of her jaw, so like Seraphina's, and the fierce intelligence in her eyes, which was all his own. He saw the kindness and resilience forged in Maeve's loving care, and the scholarly soul that was uniquely hers. She wasn't a replacement for the daughter he'd lost. She was the woman his daughter had become, shaped by a different, harder, but no less loving world. Their story was not a perfect circle, ending where it began. It was a broken line, jagged with pain and loss, in that they were only now together, learning how to draw into a new, stronger shape. Me is perfect, he said, and for the first time in 25 years, a genuine smile reached his eyes. It's a wonderful place to start. Lillian smiled back, a true, unguarded smile that lit up her whole face. The past was a finished chapter, written in grief and betrayal. But sitting there on a park bench in the autumn sun, a father and a daughter, lost and found, finally began to write their future.